what's it called? Constructive engagement. The idea was the best way to try and get China to behave more responsibly internally and externally was to engage with them, to try and get them closer, really involved in international economic processes, to encourage them to adopt a free market system, with the idea that over time this would contribute to a mellowing of the political system. And that's something of the strategy may have worked in the Soviet case. People disagree what was most important. But the key difference was the Clinton administration was, unlike the Bush administration, Clinton really didn't try and, at least during the first term, exercise dominant control over China. It wasn't really one of his priorities within the interagency. He was very focused on Russia and a few other priorities. China was not one of them. And so what happened was that you saw the various agencies within the executive branch basically run their own China policies. So the Department of Commerce would send envoys to China and demand opportunities opening up for American businesses. The U.S. Office of the Trade Representative would send people and say, no, we've got to cut back in commercial relations with China. We've got to impose sanctions. They're not protecting American property rights. Department of Defense was saying, well, we want to engage in a dialogue with the Chinese. You know, they can cut off during Tiananmen. So we got to, the Chinese military guard is a very important player within China. We need to engage with them. We need to basically understand, as their strength is rising, how they see us, maybe perhaps shape their perceptions, perhaps discourage them from trying to compete with us. At the same time, you had other groups, within Congress saying, the last thing we want to do is deal with the Chinese military. The State Department itself, and this is not only seen in other cases, has had a problem recently in that even within the department, you've got the bureaus competing and fractionalizing, so it's hard for them to put the bureau on a single position. So you got a State Department Bureau responsible for human rights, which is pushing that agenda. You had an Office of Non-Proliferation, which was pushing curbing proliferation ties. So whenever someone tried to offer a carrot, someone else would say, no, you should use a stick. And because the president, it wasn't his top priority, really nothing was getting done. You just had a series of conflicting policies, which the Chinese found very frustrating, and they were just very suspicious about whether maybe this is a good cop, bad cop routine or something. They didn't think we could be this incompetent. They thought there was a coherent strategy behind the fact that we were trying to press them to make concessions on all the different fronts and refusing to give them any rewards. After he was reelected, this changed a bit. The president became more engaged in the second term. Now he empowered Sandy Berger to impose some order. And that worked well on the trade front. They made some progress in that area. But there were all these differences that were occurring over Taiwan, over the terms of China's entry into the World Trade Organization, some of the commercial practices to that, etc., and then the espionage, and there was this other scandal about supposedly the Chinese were feeding money into the Clinton re-election campaign, and it was just causing a lot of bad press, bad feeling in Congress and elsewhere about the Chinese. And in the midst of this very poor background, you had the war in Kosovo begin in March 24th. And the Chinese were very excited about this, as were the Russians. Their position is the only body that can authorize these kinds of operations is the UN Security Council, which China, of course, has a veto, so therefore they can block any other country from using force against another country unless the UN Security Council approves. And because of the problems we understand about national sovereignty and the responsibility to protect minorities against genocide, the NATO countries felt, no, they had to, even though they didn't have a Security Council mandate, they had to intervene, they had to protect the Bosnians from what they saw as potential Serbian ethnic cleansing. And the Chinese just continually criticized this. And in the midst of this, on May 7th, 1999, the two U.S. bombers, the Air Force B-2 bombers, dropped 2,000 bombs right at the Chinese embassy and destroyed it at the south side of Belgrade. And what caused all sorts of problems was this was the one target the CIA nominated. Normally what the CIA was doing was looking at the targets were nominated in the military and trying to assess them, would this contribute to the strategy, what kind of information. But they were running out of targets, and the Serbians weren't surrendering, so they started asking people to sort of give them targets. And the CIA nominated this target of all. And what happened was, there was another coincidence, which was that the target, the part that the embassy was most destroyed, was what turned out to be China's main intelligence collection center in Europe. And it killed 2 Chinese intelligence agencies. Now, if you live in Michelle's world, you live in Susan's world, if you were a Chinese person and you found out the one target the CIA selected happened to be your main intelligence unit, you would always consider this a kind of rogue CIA operation to take out your intelligence collection operations in Europe. And that's precisely what they felt. They demanded that they were willing to maybe think maybe the president didn't know. But obviously there was some group within the United States intelligence agency which was acting on its own, trying to just get a leg up on Chinese competition. And there's more background in the book. There's a whole series of incidents the CIA was accusing China of transporting chemicals to Iran, for example. Then they opened up the ship and found actually there were no chemicals. And then so there was just a lot of bad blood between the CIA and the Chinese government. From the U.S. point of view, though, when you talk to the people involved, this was the last thing they wanted. They had no idea what was happening. I mean, they were very much focused on winning the war in Kosovo. They were very concerned about keeping the Allies in line. There's a lot of labeling the Allies. Remember, there were a lot of operational problems bringing the Apaches in. We relied on the air war mostly, which was concerned that you were having a lot of civilian casualties because you weren't using ground forces, something that we're seeing in Afghanistan now. And they, again, as I mentioned, they ran out of targets, so they just started soliciting targets whenever they could find. And now, all of a sudden, you've got China demanding that you halt your operations, and because of what happened. And the Serbs taking heart, well, gee, maybe the Chinese will intervene on our behalf, even if the Russians want it. It's precisely the last thing we wanted. The Americans, the initial response was, well, this was obviously an accident. We'll just apologize, and the Chinese will forget about it. And so they, Albright carried a letter of apology to the Chinese embassy, and the president tried to call, and Jiang didn't answer. The president of China didn't answer his phone, so he sent a letter. One problem with this response was they kept on saying, we're sorry, but we really have to continue the military operations. This ethnic genocide, cleansing Kosovo has to stop. And the Chinese were just furious. They felt that, the U.S. was just using the cloak of this campaign to take out their intelligence operations in Europe. So they demanded official apologies, some kind of compensation, and a thorough investigation, public, and then punish those responsible. That's a favorite thing. So they wanted to find out who in the CIA had done this, and they wanted them basically hung from the streets. And there was mass outrage within the Chinese people. I mean, the media was showing this on television. There were protests at the U.S. embassies and other NATO embassies. A lot of damage being done. And there was a lot of suspicion in the U.S. side that the government was just inflaming this, trying to basically maybe have the U.S. make concessions in other areas, such as the World Trade Organization and so on. Eventually, they did basically what Bush did. They reached out to the Chinese government, and they sent over Undersecretary of State Pickering, who tried to do what anyone here in Washington would do. He had a good PowerPoint briefing. He showed about why this was a mistake. And the Chinese just refused to accept it, but they let it go. The relations suffered succinctly, and they had a monetary settlement. But